one of the difficulties that I had in trying to consider what it was I would say about independent journalism as I spent the last several days thinking about it. And it's not really an issue that I would ever really finally resolve, is that if you actually think about it, the term independent journalism is a very strange term. It's actually a term that we ought not even recognize as something that is coherent or sensible at all. I mean, the concept of independence, the attribute of independence, is so inherent in what journalism is that if somebody uses the phrase independent journalism, it ought to strike us as some sort of ridiculous redundancy. I mean, how can you possibly have journalism without independence? It should be a phrase that need not even be Actually, I was trying to think of some analogies. I mean, it would be like if I stood up here and said, tonight I want to talk about four-legged dogs or human beings who require oxygen in order to breathe. You would say, well, why do you even need to modify the terms that way? What other kinds are there? To me, that's how the term independent journalism strikes me. It would be, my initial reaction is to say, well, why do we even need to modify the term journalism that way, given that you can't have journalism without independence? I mean, there are ways to disseminate information to the public without being independent. I mean, if R.E. Fleischer or Robert Gibbs stands up at a podium and they disseminate information to the public, they're not acting independently, they're acting as captives to the interests of the White House and the president. Or if you work as a PR hack, or as a paid spokesperson, or even as a lawyer, and you stand up and you speak, you're not actually speaking and disseminating information with independence, you're speaking captive to the interests of someone else. But there is no way to be a journalist and to practice journalism and disseminate information to the public as a journalist without being independent. And so that term really ought not require the adjective independence before it in order to designate what it is that we mean, and yet it does. And in fact, if we use the term independent media or independent journalism, it doesn't actually strike any of us as odd at all, unless we really think about it, because the concept of journalism has been so distorted that in its default sense, if you just talk about journalism in its predominant form in the United States, you actually are describing an activity that doesn't have any independence to it at all. And so if you want to talk about journalism in its aberrational sense, in the sense in which it acts as an exception, you do need to specify that what you mean is not journalism, but a different entity, independent journalism. And I think that if you actually think about it that way, and the need to modify the term journalism with independent in order to explain what you mean, there's actually a lot of significance about how journalism typically in this country is practiced. So I think, the term independent journalism, because of that, is something that actually does designate something recognizable and something meaningful to all of us. And yet it's still not particularly easy to describe what independent journalism actually means. And I was trying to think about what a definition of independent journalism would be. And I think the best way that I could convey it is through this analogy. Ever since the advent of blogging, there's been all kinds of discussions about what is the difference between bloggers and journalists. What makes you a blogger? What makes you a journalist? And for a while, that used to be an easy question to answer. Bloggers were people who essentially wrote primarily online and used things like links and online writing and comment sections and interaction with their readers. And journalists were people who either wrote for newspapers and in print, or who went on television and on network shows and major corporate media and delivered information that way. And the distinction between bloggers and journalists was easy to see. What's happened over the last couple of years is that most of those major media outlets have now become engaged in the activity of what is typically considered blogging. They are principally devoted to online communication. Many of them have what they call blogs. And I actually have done several panels in the past couple of years with major media figures, people who call themselves journalists, who practice that without independence. And they are the people who work for major corporations. And when this question arises, well, what is the difference now between a blogger and a journalist? Many of them will say, oh, guess what? there are no more differences. Those differences have eroded because we too now write online, and we too now use links, and we too now write things that we call blogs. And so this distinction between bloggers and journalists, mainstream journalists, doesn't actually exist anymore. That's the argument that they would make. And I always found that thought quite horrifying. The idea that we've now converged into this sort of undifferentiated mass. And so I was always resistant to the idea that you couldn't tell the difference any longer between bloggers and journalists because they now write online. And the argument that I would always make, and the distinction that I would always try to draw, is that there is still a fundamental and radical difference in the mentality that defines what a mainstream journalist is or an establishment journalist versus a blogger. And you can know what a blogger does by looking at what mainstream journalism or establishment journalism does, and bloggers are a reaction to the things that those establishment journalists do. Blogging essentially arose to fulfill the functions that journalists were failing so profoundly to fulfill. If they were doing their jobs, there wouldn't be bloggers. The fact that they're not doing their jobs is what caused there to be this advent of blogging. And so you can know what a blogger is, as distinguished from a journalist,